And
out of recent Youth Art Roundtable discussions has come the question about how we raise the profile of youth arts, perhaps give it the value that we all believe that it deserves.
And as teachers and artists, we have a passion for improving the lives of young people. In schools and in theatres, we help them to share their view of life, and we help them to show their skill and energy.
And a lot of these kids use art as a healing tool. They don't want to be put in a room and talking to a counsellor. They don't want to be asked 1,000 questions. They use art as their voice.
Prior to being involved in circus arts, I've been trying for many years to be involved in dance for many, many years. However, I had to unfortunately drop out because it was just impossible for the instructor to understand me and for me to understand them. Many times I would give them instruction around how to communicate with a deaf person, these are the protocols and rules, but it never occurred. And also, there wasn't really an awful lot of provision of interpreters. It was very, very difficult. There's no Auslan interpreter involved. So it was until I was involved in the circus arts, to allow me to participate equally within the circus arts. And now I can be involved with Volcano Women's Circus, who provide interpreters.
And we need your leadership to encourage collaboration and partnership between the fields of the arts and other non-arts government departments. So we're asking for your help to increase capacity by assisting the youth arts sector to create innovative partnerships across other government departments that will help generate economies of scale and open access to external funding opportunities for wider social youth arts outcomes. We'd like to see partnerships created between the arts and Departments of Health, Communities, Child Safety and Disabilities, Indigenous Affairs, Infrastructure, Education, Training and Employment, Local Government and Community Recovery.
How do we make the youth arts sector better recognised and valued for the contribution it makes to the overall arts sector and to young people more generally? So for all of us who work in youth arts, we'd already know that the benefits and impact that the arts has on a young person and what that is. But if we start to look at the monetary figure that youth arts companies receive, 7.57% of the total S2M funding pot in 2012 went to youth arts companies. Yet as we've just heard from Stephen, 40% of the population are under 30. So I guess that's why we think it's important that we have youth arts recognised in the Arts for All Queenslanders strategy.
We completely understand that the arts sector is being cut by $12.4 million. Considering this, we need for the value and impact of youth arts to be invested in incrementally over time. Investing in the future of Queensland's arts industry requires a fundamental need to support and sustain the youth arts industry now as its foundation. We'd like to see investment matched by other departments as well in those partnerships that we create.
Perhaps starting with what Steve said, and in particular, Steve, your concentration on what's happening in schools, firstly. And I suppose my immediate reaction to that is that if I were looking at a spectrum of youth arts and where I think we need to put in effort, schools probably wouldn't be at the top of the list. And the reason I say that is twofold. One is we've already got a reasonably good program there. We've got the Artist in Residence program, which is co-funded with the Feds to 250 grand, which gets Artist in Residence into schools. It's a start. I know it's not what might be the end of the story. But my immediate reaction, and I'd be interested to hear if you think I'm wrong, my immediate reaction is that, in fact, I'm getting pressure at the other end of the spectrum. So I'm the Minister for Science, IT, Innovation and the Arts. The general message I'm getting from my advisors and from people I talk to is that, in fact, I've got to get more kids out of the arts and into science and the hard end. So that's what people are saying to me. That for me, the immediate thing I'd be focusing on is how we enable the transition of kids out of school into the industry. That would be, for me, more important than schooling. So, as I said, I'm happy to get feedback on that because you might think I'm entirely wrong. in that regard, I've had a couple of thoughts which I've started to discuss with my department. One of them, I think, is the need for courses in arts to include some business component. I feel artists often sell their skills far too cheaply and are not skilled in those other business areas that allow them to value their skills properly. For example, I've met many artists who will say, look, I reckon if I do this concert free and next month's concert free, they'll see how good it is and they'll pay me a mozza for the third concert. I met yesterday with the representatives of the visual arts community from throughout Australia, and they're providing online courses now for visual artists to gain those skills. And to me, that's the sort of area where we would find some good feedback. So the speeches tonight have impressed me, and I'm sure I didn't need any impression, but they have impressed me on the value of what is being done. I don't think that's an issue for debate, with me or with the government. The issue for debate in Imogen, which were about the need for other departments to buy into arts, and certainly there's a lot of good material on what arts can do in a medicinal healing way and what arts can do in a social way. And I might ask you to come back. You had a list of departments there and you went through them pretty quickly, but I'd just be interested to know how you felt they might have a particular relationship to arts. But that seemed to me to pick up on Brett's story. Your speech, Deb, got to me to, I suppose, a great practical example, and it was your issue about the ticket and the ticket pricing. A real problem, an acknowledged problem, and I suppose the question then is, what do we do about it? How do we fix that? I suppose some people would say, well, the government should subsidise the tickets. Guess what? The government's not going to be subsidising the tickets. So what we've got to do is think of creative ways of collaborating, whatever it is, to find a way to get you into the proper spaces at an affordable price. My first job is to make sure that the arts doesn't suffer at the benefit of other things. So I suppose, to put it in broad terms, the arts got to cop its share, but no more than its share. And I'm satisfied that that's happening, but I've got to make sure that keeps happening. So from a broad term, what does it mean in funding terms if the government's not going to be chucking more money into the pot? It means the money we do throw into the pot, we will want to see go further, and we want to see collaborative and better things happen with it. And a lot of you I know are already doing good things in that area. Rachel, thank you very much for your presentation. It had an impact obviously on youth arts, but you raised a much broader issue in relation to the involvement of deaf people in the arts and Auslan interpreters and so on. I think it probably deserves a more specific response than the broader response that we need to give to involving youth in arts, but I can see how it has an impact. I would like to meet with appropriate representatives of YAC, and I don't know how that's best done, whether you guys nominate some people, but I suppose a manageable group of people who could meet with me and take some specific issues forward. The particular ones I'm thinking about are one, to formulate a response to the Arts for All Queenslanders document, which goes up for discussion I think on Monday. I signed off on it earlier in the week. My immediate impression is that, and I didn't look at it with these particular eyes, so I might be wrong, but my immediate impression is that you might think it needs to address youth issues more forcefully than it does. And so if I could just alert you to the fact that it's up there for discussion, and if you've got a response, get in there and give one to us, because now's the time for discussion of that paper. And it might help if I meet separately with YAC in order to understand better what we might be able to say. As I said, one, a response to the Arts for All Queenslanders document, and I would like to meet with YAC to hear that firsthand. And so you might need to do a bit of work on it first before you come. Secondly, I was just interested, particularly Imogen, and I'd ask you perhaps to go back to this point if you could, and they were those other departments you mentioned. I'd just like to get a feeling in my mind for why you think they may have a particular role, and then I think that's probably another area we could talk specifically about.
Well, we've been working with the deaf community for the last 7 years, and recently Rachel's become a trainee, and she's also a member of our board. And every time we've needed to get an interpreter so those deaf people can have access to our general classes.
I'm just interested in your view or the community's view on audiences, arts audiences. What happens at the moment if a deaf person wants to go and see a play? How do you get access to that?
The Lion King show, yeah. So we go up, it's a huge show, it's a huge company that's putting on that. So we might say, look, could you provide Aussie interpreters for this show? And it really depends on the time, and it never ever happens.
But the biggest issue that I see with tourism and events is if we lived in a regional area, there's actually a regional funding program, but because we live in Brisbane, our events only can play in the major events field. There is no funding program for the small events here in Brisbane, and I know that they're looking at some changes at the moment, and that one in particular I think would assist a lot of us to engage with them.
And I'll come back to graduate pathways, and a lot of the people that I deal with will give up. And in fact, the conversations I've had recently, because of the lack of Australia Council funding, to partner with the Arts Queensland funding required, has led to quite an impact on morale. And I've, in the last 4 weeks, had conversations with people who have been in the industry looking after young people and paying them to dance, who are actually going to withdraw from the industry because of lack of support and lack of funding.
Really about brokerage, that we understand the pots everywhere shrink, but I guess some of the examples people are talking about are how we can use you in your department and across Parliament, but also the staff's connection. So a classic example is we Contact Inc. is the lead agent for the Creative Recovery Network, and we're rolling out that creative recovery work in the 4 South East, but we did an 18-month pilot last year, and the outcomes out of that are because community recovery, but broadly, areas like the idea of infrastructure are pretty into bricks and mortar. People understand that. And interestingly, from the 10-11 events in community, some of the most impacted were children. And we know from the Kinglake fires in Victoria that children were showing up in grade 1 with anxiety disorders, because if you're a child, you can't differentiate that the image of fire on TV doesn't mean it's happened every day. Same thing happened in Queensland with the flood images continuously. Children are incredibly traumatised across the state, and whether they were inundated in their house or not. But what's really interesting was from the 10-11 events, we couldn't get a place at the table anywhere. Like everyone was just like, arts, who cares? I was in Manchester last year and I saw there was a science and art festival. So in terms of your response to whether we need to get kids out of the arts and into the science, I would say, why are we running a subject called art and science? I think we've got some really big challenges even within the department, that while we know the small to medium sector has been impacted with funding cuts, we've also heard that the major statutory authorities and festivals have been kept at standard funding levels. And I think, again, a little bit like trying to knock on the doors of the other departments, sometimes we can't even knock on the doors of those big institutions in our own field. So having a relationship within the department, whether the youth arts sector, that provides so much into the ecology of those big organisations, we do actually really need your support to be able to just to kind of find our way through.
I think, Imogen, if I could ask you, and I'll ask Mark to liaise with you about a meeting with GAC representatives. As I said, I'd particularly like to actually go through your submission on Arts for All Queenslanders and how you think that may need to be amended to reflect the concerns that you have.
Absolutely.
Number 2, the departments. I'd like to do a bit more work on that. And actually the issue that Lenine just raised, I think, about brokerage and, you know, in particular what Lorna's section can do, and I'll ask Lorna to sit in obviously on that meeting as well. They're just 3 things that I wouldn't want to leave hanging in the air, but there may be more. So if you can liaise with Mark to get an agenda for that, they are 3 things I would like to see on it, but you may feel after our discussion that there should be more.
Thank you.